welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is a risk management firm specialising in financial crime. Our aim of these podcasts is to bring you interesting news, interviews and recordings of our exclusive events from the world of financial crime. Proliferation Financing 101. Viri Chauhan from Themis talks with Dr Jonathan Brewer, who is an expert on proliferation financing. Dr Brewer is a visiting professor at King's College London and has held several UN posts related to sanctions and proliferation financing. Listen to this podcast to find out how proliferation financing is connected to money laundering and sanctions, and what financial institutions should do about managing it.
Welcome to this Themis podcast on proliferation financing. My name is Viri Chauhan. I'm the MD of the Themis community. Today I'm really pleased to have Dr Jonathan Brewer, a visiting professor at London King's College and an expert on proliferation financing. Jonathan, so pleased to have you on this podcast. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Viri, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. Proliferation finance is something that I think is extremely important. And by way of background, I'm based in New York at the moment. I work as a consultant at the United Nations. I had a 28-year career in the UK Foreign Service with substantive postings in Angola, in Mexico, and in Russia. And spent a fair amount of my career working on non-proliferation financing developed in the last few years. So that's me by way of background.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. If we could start by providing for our listeners, just in basic terms, what do we mean by proliferation financing?
It's a good question. It's not a subject that's particularly widely understood, but what we're talking about, to start off, the basic subject is it's weapons of mass destruction. So we're talking about nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and within the definition is included usually delivery systems, so typically ballistic missiles. Also, we are talking about the so-called related materials. So it's the equipment, the goods, technology that is used to construct weapons of mass destruction. And it's important to include these related materials because authorities seeking to control proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, in other words, the trade around the world, very rarely come across examples of finished weapons systems being traded. It's the related materials.
So what we're talking about, when you talk about proliferation financing, at the sort of the highest levels, we're talking about the actual weaponry and sort of what we'd class as weapons of war, really. And then you mentioned we've also got to take into account sort of the ancillary aspects of what constitutes those weapons. Is that what you're saying?
Indeed it is. So it's not just the weapons themselves. It's the equipment, the technology, the materials that can be used to construct these weapons. And over the last decades, it's become a lot easier to construct these weapons because of technological advances in many countries. Hence, the focus in many cases on the related materials as opposed to the weapons themselves in terms of operations to try to stop proliferation. On financing, we are talking about provision of funds or financial services which enable the construction of weapons of mass destruction or their transport or the transport of the related materials. There is no overall understood definition of proliferation financing. There's no United Nations definition, for example. The Financial Action Task Force, a well-known body which sets global standards on financial crime prevention, produced a working definition in 2010, which basically identified proliferation financing as the act of providing funds or financial services used for a large number of activities related to weapons of mass destruction, for example, their manufacture or acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling or use. And actually, that's a good definition. It covers a very wide range of activities. And many countries incorporate that definition into their legislation.
We wanted to make clear in that FATF definition, those activities are included if carried out in contravention of national laws or, where applicable, international obligations.
In recent years, the definition has extended to include raising funds, reflecting recent or over the last 4 or 5 years UN Security Council sanctions resolutions on North Korea, which are focused on some of the ways that North Korea raises funds.
Okay, so what's the connection with what people would be more familiar with, like, for example, money laundering, sanctions, and terrorist financing? Is there a connection, or are they sort of separate sort of typologies?
When you talk about the typologies of proliferation financing, you can come up with a number of them, but it's really quite difficult coming up with a specific typology that clearly indicates proliferation financing. A lot of the typologies could also indicate other sorts of financial crime, terrorist financing, for example, money laundering, for example. So in terms of the typologies, there is some overlap. In terms of the sort of issue itself, well, of course, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction can be conducted by states, but it could also be conducted by so-called non-state actors, terrorist groups, for example, who seek to try to use chemical weapons, for example, as was documented in Iraq by ISIL back in 2015, 2016. And so, and these terrorist groups. So, there's some overlap there between proliferation financing and terrorist financing. On money laundering, so, one of the points is money laundering, we're often talking about very large sums of money, yes, obtained by criminal means. Terrorist financing, often talking about rather small sums of money, perhaps a few tens of thousands or $100,000s of dollars. Proliferation financing sort of falls into the middle in terms of the sums we're talking about. We're often talking about acquisition of industrial goods, shipments of high-grade steel, for example, or carbon fiber. But the techniques used in proliferation financing often involve the same techniques as money launderers use to shift money around, the involvement of front companies, for example, or other mechanisms that try to obscure the ultimate beneficial owner of financial transactions and or acquisition of goods and materials.
So what about the sort of the main actors who are involved in proliferation financing? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Looking at the world at the moment, the two main actors would be North Korea and Iran. And those are quite easy to, in a sense, to identify because both those countries are subject to United Nations Security Council resolutions intended to stop development of weapons of mass destruction, or in the case of Iran, it's to control the nuclear program. Iran has always stated that its nuclear program is not intended for nuclear weapons. And North Korea, of course, has boldly stated that its nuclear program is for nuclear weapons. So one needs to make a slight distinction between those two countries, but basically, those are the two countries identified as the main sources of proliferation threats at the moment. There are other countries, however, that one needs to consider. So, for example, Syria, which has an active government chemical weapons program, and there have been allegations of use of chemical weapons by the government on its population. There have also been allegations of use of chemical weapons in Syria by terrorist groups, and there's a continuing debate on that subject. Nevertheless, there are some unilateral sanctions on Syria imposed, for example, by the European Union and by a number of European and other member states. So there's Syria. Then there are two very interesting countries, Pakistan and India, neither of which are subject to any sorts of sanctions, but they have active nuclear weapons programs. Neither Either country sits within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example. And many observers would regard India and Pakistan's nuclear programs as being a source of significant potential regional instability. And although neither program is subject to sanctions, many countries have export controls in place designed to ensure that no exports of proliferation-sensitive materials to the nuclear weapons programs of those two countries. There are other countries who one hears about as being potential WMD or nuclear weapons states in future. Such countries include Saudi Arabia, for example, perhaps other states in the Middle East. And then, of course, there's the constant theme that perhaps if the US were to withdraw its nuclear umbrella from some of the states in Asia, that some of those states might develop their own weapons programs for defensive measures. But I should emphasize very much that there's a lot of speculation in terms of future WMD states, but those that I've mentioned are those that would currently be regarded as constituting specific significant threats.
So it sounds like the sanctions regime is a method of potentially managing some of these what we would class as rogue states activity in proliferation financing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so the United Nations Security Council, when that imposes sanctions, those are widely regarded as being very legitimate measures taken by the international community as a whole. It's the United Nations, 193 member states. Yeah. If you sign up as a member state of the United Nations, you sign up to implement Security Council resolutions. The sanctions on Syria, for example, those are not United Nations sanctions. And some countries implement those, other countries do not implement those. So they do not have the sort of universal impact as to Security Council sanctions.
When you were talking about proliferation financing, something occurred to me, which I've heard a lot, is a term called dual-use goods. Could you explain how that fits into the proliferation financing sort of agenda and what that means?
No, it's a very good question. So dual-use goods are goods that have both perfectly legitimate industrial uses, but also are necessary for construction of weapons of mass destruction programs. There are a number of so-called multilateral export control regimes which publish lists of such goods, which get updated annually. So, for example, there's the Nuclear Suppliers Group, that publishes lists of nuclear program-related dual-use goods. The Australia Group does the same for biological and chemical weapons related goods. The MT Missile Technology Control Regime publishes lists for missiles. United Nations sanctions resolutions on North Korea include references to these sorts of lists. And many countries, when they draw up their own export control legislation, include these lists because they're a very useful way to ensure that manufacturers, if they are trying to export such dual-use goods, first of all, can identify them, and then the authorities can say you need licenses to export these. In other words, checks need to be carried out that a shipment, for example, of high-grade steel or high-grade carbon fiber, which could be used in the construction of missiles, for example, is in fact going to a perfectly legitimate civil industrial purpose and not to a WMD program. And so when talking about proliferation finance, we're talking often about the financing of these sorts of dual-use goods. It's important that when you're building a nuclear weapons program, for example, you may need to import not just dual-use goods, but other standard industrial goods. And so if you're an authority and you're trying to control completely exports of goods and materials and the financing to WMD programs, you need certainly to have these controls on dual-use goods, but you need to have some other sort of language in your legislation to ensure that end-use controls, for example, to ensure that some of these other items are not also going to nefarious purposes.
A quick pause, if I may, to briefly talking about Themis. Themis helps clients and members identify and manage their specific financial crime risks through a combination of innovation, insight, and intelligence. Our cutting-edge platform helps organizations understand these strategic threats through an ESG and socio-economic lens and protects their customers, staff, suppliers, and shareholders from criminal attacks or association. Visit our website at www.crime.financial to find out more. So I suppose it becomes quite challenging in terms of detecting proliferation financing for organizations and regions. What do you think the challenges are? And are there any examples of good practice that we could be made aware of?
No, it's a very good point. It is challenging. And when you talk to financial institutions about proliferation financing, they will immediately say, well, how can we detect proliferation financing? We're not often talking about a very large number of transactions. The sums involved aren't very distinctive. The messaging systems, Swift messages, for example, do not contain the necessary information in many cases. It is a challenge. And it looks like proliferation financing looks like the financing of international trade, legitimate international trade. The transactions either take place through open account mechanisms or in some cases, trade finance mechanisms could be used where banks get involved. And if the banks get involved, there's a certain amount of documentation they can check. But then banks say, well, how do we don't have specialists on particular types of equipment. How are we expected to go to the docks and inspect ourselves in person? Obviously, we can't do that. So it is challenging. But I think there are ways forward here. And terrorist financing, for example, is similarly challenging. We're not talking about huge numbers of transactions. They may be in terms of terrorist financing, really quite localized. Problem with proliferation financing is that the global financial system is used, and some of these proliferation financing networks, may cover many jurisdictions. Perhaps not so much the case with terrorist financing, but nevertheless, when terrorist financing became a big issue after 9/11, a large amount of new legislation was imposed and systems put in place by the private sector to conduct monitoring of terrorist finance typologies. And I personally think that more could be done by the private sector in incorporating some of the known typologies of proliferation financing into their monitoring systems that they've set up for terrorist financing and for money laundering. So that is one area where I think more could be done. But of course, for understandable reasons, it's expensive. Private sector isn't going to do that unless regulators require them to do that.
On that point, Jonathan, on the typologies, for the regulated sector, the private sector, they have quite a large suite of standards. For example, they have the FATF standards for AML and CTF and sort of relevant legislation. Is there any equivalence for proliferation financing that they could refer to?
The Financial Action Task Force, of course, which is often the source of regulatory standards, does include in its current recommendations, 40 recommendations, standards related to proliferation finance. So recommendation 7, which requires FATF countries to implement United Nations Security Council designations and asset freezes related to the sanctions on North Korea and sanctions on Iran. So there is that. There is a FATF recommendation 2, which is a very important recommendation. It's a requirement for states to have proper interdepartmental coordination and communication systems in place. And this is important because proliferation finance potentially touches on a large number of areas of different departmental responsibilities. So it's not just the Ministry of Finance or the Financial Intelligence Unit, but it could be customs, for example, or licensing authorities, or the intelligence agencies may have information. So having these proper coordinated authority system in place is very important. But most importantly, I think, is that recently, or last year, the Financial Action Task Force incorporated into Recommendation 1 a requirement for states and their private sector to conduct proliferation financing risk assessments. The definition of risk in this case is rather narrow. It's the risk of circumvention or non-implementation or evasion of targeted financial sanctions. And we were talking about the definition of proliferation financing at the start. And the proliferation financing goes much wider than simply targeted financial sanctions. Nevertheless, the fact that the Financial Action Task Force has implemented this resolution is going to require countries to conduct these risk assessments. It's going to require countries to require their financial institutions to conduct these risk assessments. And although it relates to a limited definition of proliferation financing, it's going to get the concept of proliferation financing, in my opinion, into the FATF bloodstream in a very significant way. This recommendation will need to be implemented during the next round of FATF evaluations, and I believe that starts in a year or a couple of years. So it's not immediate, but I think it means we're going to see some big developments on proliferation financing over the next 5 to 10 year period.
So would that indicate that it may actually then go into European directives and potentially UK legislation as well?
Yes, it will. So one of the very important aspects of being a member of the Financial Action Task Force is that each country is evaluated periodically on its implementation of the standards. And these evaluations are hugely important. If you're a country that comes out badly from a FATF evaluation, it looks as though your financial system is perhaps not properly regulated, not properly controlled, could be exploited by criminals, for example. No country wants that because it's bad for business. So countries do put a lot of effort into ensuring that they come out well from these FATF evaluations. And to come out well, they will need to show that they have appropriate legislation in place to meet the standards and that it's being enforced and evaluated.
What about the role of cryptocurrency and proliferation financing?
No, it's that. So this is a very interesting area, I think, because clearly there are cryptocurrencies being more and more widely used, both as a way of generating wealth, but also for trading value. And I think it's very interesting that some of the reports that have been published over the last couple of years by a panel of experts that supports UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea has included reference to North Korea's use of cryptocurrencies. Use of cryptocurrencies to raise funds. At the moment, I'm not aware that there are references to significant use by North Korea of cryptocurrencies to say pay for proliferation related goods and materials. That may be happening, we just don't know about it. And I think when you look at trade finance at the moment, trade finance takes place using fiat currencies, but when trade finance starts taking place with cryptocurrencies, then I think we're going to see more use of cryptocurrencies to finance proliferation as well. But that's something perhaps for the near to middle term future. I'm not sure it's actually happening at present.
And if we focus in on the UK then, there's a recent UK national risk assessment on proliferation financing. What were your main takeaways from that?
A good document, I have to say. The UK is, I think, the fifth or sixth or seventh country to have published a proliferation financing national risk assessment in the last couple of 2 or 3 years. And when you read these risk assessments, they tend to be not, I wouldn't say uniform, but the sources of the threats are often, quite similar. And this goes back to the fact we're dealing with the global financial system. It's the vulnerabilities, I think, which are very interesting, and they are specific to different countries. And so the vulnerabilities identified in the UK National Risk Assessment include the fact that the UK is a global financial centre, that it's a centre for the insurance and maritime sector. It's a country in which it's relatively easy to establish businesses, front companies, for example. It's also a country with a large number of so-called designated non-financial businesses and professions, and those are sectors where often compliance standards aren't as developed as in the financial sector. There's a reference in the Proliferation Financing Risk Assessment to crown dependencies and overseas territories. I personally am not sure that those necessarily represent a source of risk. Some of these crown dependencies have done a lot of work themselves over the last few years on proliferation financing. Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, for example. Cayman Islands, as an overseas territory, has produced a very good proliferation financing risk assessment last year. But the UK assessment refers as well to the fact that it's a manufacturing centre for dual-use goods. It's also a global education and research hub, and this is an important point as well. And then the final point mentioned is that the general knowledge of proliferation financing in the private sector is quite low. So, this comes back to the fact that more work needs to be done, more outreach to the private sector to raise awareness. So those are the takeaway. I think there's a very interesting list of vulnerabilities there, many of which are not specific to the UK, but the fact that they're so clearly listed is a very good aspect of this risk assessment.
Drawing this interview to a close, from your expertise and experience, what would be your one piece of advice or guidance to our listeners in terms of addressing proliferation financing and what they can do?
I would suggest that your listeners need to first of all be aware of the threat. And in that respect, I think it would be worth them reading the UK's proliferation financing risk assessment. And then I think they need to think about their own position in terms of areas of vulnerability. And then they need to think about how to address that. And there are various sources of expertise. Of course, the government itself, UK Treasury, has got people who can provide advice. There are also some UK research and academic institutions that have published a lot of material on this. So King's College in London, for example, has done a fair amount of work on typologies. The Royal United Services Institute in London has also published guidance on conducting risk assessments. So I think awareness, thinking about vulnerabilities, and then reaching out to organizations and centers of information is a very good way to start off addressing this issue.
Jonathan, it's been a really enlightening discussion that we've had with you today. I've certainly been educated in this area, and I'm sort of keen to find out more. And I'm looking forward to reading those recommendations that you've provided. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, and good luck to everybody in conducting proliferation financing risk assessment.
Thank you for listening to the latest Themis podcast. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you would like to find out more about Themis, get in touch with us via our website, www.crime.financial. You can also subscribe for future news and interviews.